You might believe in destiny. But if you ask me, and I'm glad you did, there is one powerful force that drives human behavior and changes the world. Money. As a New Jersey high school student in the early 1980s, I learned all about the lost cause of the Civil War. It was this tragic struggle, brother between brother, all fought to preserve something very important called states' rights. It was replete with gallantry and heroism, and it had some really great fiddle tunes. It wasn't until later that I thought to ask the question, a state's right to do what? Exactly. Well, as it turns out, it was the right to treat other human beings as cattle, to buy and sell them, to beat them and kill them and rape them. Also, they could, as Lincoln put it, wring their bread from the sweat of another's brow. But why was I, born a century after the war, taught a false history about it? Why did my northern school teach me the Southern myth? How come instead of Nat Turner and Frederick Douglass, I got Rhett and Scarlett? In Technicolor, even catastrophe is glorious. Margaret Mitchell's husband, seeing rebel extras stretching to the horizon as Atlanta burned on the RKO back lot, remarked, "If we had had that many soldiers, we would have won." This has started to be a story that the South told about themselves within living memory of the people who had done it.
Yeah, and it certainly played well among them.
Right.
It also, part of that narrative was also the reason you lost is not because you were lesser.
Right.
In fact, you were superior. You had more nobility, more honor, more courage. You only lost because the other side was just so overwhelmingly huge, this giant, soulless industrial machine.
North crushed the poor agrarian, yet, and amazing how they fought given their lack of resources.
So you get super props for going down, valiantly and so forth. And then the other part of that is that it wasn't about slavery, but by the way, slavery wasn't all that bad.
Right. Nothing says it better than the prologue to Gone with the Wind. There was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields called the Old South. Here gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last of master and slave. Slave plantations weren't the last outpost of chivalry. They were America's first big business. Take free labor, add a global demand for textiles, and you've got an industrial behemoth. You can follow the money from consumer to mill to planter who used it to buy more slaves. In the words of one fugitive slave, when the price of cotton rises in the English market, the poor slaves are harder driven, and the whip is kept constantly going. By 1860, the South was wealthier than any European country except England. And it was all thanks to King Cotton.
Oh, Dixie, the land of King Cotton, the home of the brave and free, a nation by freedom begotten, the terror of despots to be.
They were fighting for slavery because slavery was basically the engine of the entire Southern economy, right?
Right, and also the Southern identity. So you have about 1/3 of Southern families in what becomes the Confederacy own slaves. So it's a pretty substantial number. And then of that 2/3 that don't own, there's certainly a very large proportion who aspired to. Like they weren't there yet, but they hoped in 10 or 20 years they may do what successful people do, which is to own enslaved labor.
Yeah.
So there's that aspiration. And then there's also just the value, that sort of intangible value of white supremacy, which is that no matter how poor I am as a white farmer or a white mechanic or what have you in the South, I am better than millions of other people in this society. There's a floor below which I cannot fall, because that's where the enslaved people are.
In the 1830s, England made the moral decision to abolish slavery, and they came up with a pile of cash to compensate the slave owners. But Southern slave masters refused to relinquish their property at any price. They were both rich and self-righteous.
Slaveholders told themselves lots of stories while they were holding slaves, and they told themselves how great they were, how kind they were, how benevolent the system was, and they sold that in photos, in images, in plays, and music.
Even prior to the Civil War,
Absolutely.
that there was this notion, oh no, we're treating them very well, they're better off, you don't know how bad they had it in Africa.
Yeah, abolitionists are crazy.
I mean, I understand who they were trying to fool. Yeah. Were they fooling themselves? Did they actually believe this?
They do. Some do. There's a lot of evidence that as the Civil War comes along, and of course it's incredibly disruptive, many of the men are off fighting, and so women are head of the household, and as things begin to unravel in the South, the enslaved people start to realize that they could walk away, and they start to resist. And there's these really amazing, letters people write to each other. A woman writing to her sister saying, "You will never believe what happened today. They left. They just packed up and left after all we've done for them."
Rebel leaders were clear-eyed and brutally honest. The Mississippi Declaration of Secession proclaimed, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization." So the Confederate Army couldn't conquer the North, but this myth of the lost cause eventually did. And I think it's because we somehow needed it to be true. There had to be something noble about the Confederacy. It couldn't be that half the nation took up arms to defend evil. Consider Robert E. Lee, for example. I was taught that he was a gentleman, a reluctant warrior who acted out of a kind of tragic loyalty to his state rather than his country. He was a good Christian, and he hated slavery, right? Well, Robert E. Lee himself owned 200 slaves, and when his property displeased him, he lashed them 50 times with a bullwhip because, as Robert E. Lee wrote, "This painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race." So, how did this slaver and traitor become a hero on 1,000 pedestals? Well, the beard helped. It's important to look the part.
They've caught a spy. I approve the execution order, sir.
I am unwilling that there shall be a single life lost unnecessarily. I wonder if you'd mind countermanding that order.
I will, yes, sir.
Lee lived under foreign domination. He led a sacred cause and fell at the hands of the unrighteous, just like Jesus. Oh, here's my favorite part. No less than FDR called Lee one of our greatest American Christians. Churchill upped the ante. He said he was the noblest American who ever lived. Take that, Lincoln, you loser. Jesus Christ and Robert E. Lee. Really, the only difference is that the historical Jesus was almost certainly dark-skinned. But here's the real message. If Lee was divinely virtuous, then so was the Southern cause. Thankfully, Frederick Douglass dispensed with these rose-colored glasses. When Lee died, Douglass wrote, "We can scarcely take up a newspaper that is not filled with nauseating flatteries. It would seem that the soldier who kills the most men in battle, even in a bad cause, is the greatest Christian. and entitled to the highest place in heaven. As payback for Lee's treason, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton seized his stately home and converted the grounds into Arlington National Cemetery. There's a reason people describe the cost of war as blood and treasure, but some people who had enough treasure could avoid giving any blood. Up north, the powers that be agreed that they should not have to dirty their fine hands. The draft law allowed anyone to buy a substitute for $300, the annual income of a working man. Oddly, not everyone was thrilled with this system.
Lots of working class people begin to really push back against the draft, and that pushback explodes in July of 1863 in New York City. 4 days of full-on rioting. It's the worst civil uprising in American history. They destroyed buildings, they destroyed recruiting offices. They also beat up rich people. They would say, "There goes a $300 man," and run across the street and pound a guy who looked wealthy, because the assumption was he's here because he's bought his way out of the draft.
The war begun to protect wealthy landowners ends by jump-starting the industrial age. Cornelius Vanderbilt and railroads, J.P. Morgan and weapons, Andrew Carnegie and iron, John D. Rockefeller and oil all made their first fortunes as war speculators. Those who follow the money had learned a priceless lesson. War is good for business. After the war, both sides were eager to get back to business. Widespread segregation recreated a permanent black underclass, a source of cheap labor to make the white man, North and South, rich. The lost cause becomes a national myth.
Just so much easier to buy that narrative, to say it was a big mistake, it wasn't about slavery, and now the real story is reunification, this idea, reconciliation, that both sides are to blame, and you see this in the annual commemorations.
All of them we honor, not asking under which flag they fought then, thankful that they stand together under one flag now.
So the reason I was taught these myths in high school, meaning the reason that this became the nationally accepted version, is because believing that was important to the national economy for 100 years. Oh, it's okay that we have this underpaid lower caste of black people because they underpinned a lot of our economy.
Right,
It was in everybody's financial interest to lie about the history.
Right, everything is fine as it is, and of course in the 20th century, post-war, white Americans' fortunes are soaring. It's the great post-war boom, and so it's easy to sort of focus on that as saying we, as a country, are doing great.
Yeah,
even though
we're doing great. We've always been great.
And there's a subset that is not doing great.
We had this little disagreement, but it's fine. It's okay. We have some memorials now. Everything's cool. Everybody's happy about it, except for those people, but no one's going to ask them.
Right.
There is a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Manchester, England. That is an ocean beyond the farthest he ever traveled in life. During the Civil War, the Confederacy shipped slave-grown cotton to Manchester to be processed. In exchange, they hoped for money to fund their war, but the British mill workers refused to work with the slave-grown cotton. They had a lot of sympathy for the slaves, and they certainly did not want to help the slave masters. Abraham Lincoln called their sacrifice sublime Christian heroism. So now there's a statue to him there. It's kind of amazing, really, that these British workers, pretty poor themselves, decided to put principle over self-interest. In the end, they were the ones who finally wouldn't follow the money.